この本のタイトル、スイッチクラフトという言葉の意味について教えてください。
The book is really about the importance of being very agile and, having a lot of, so we all know that when we have different problems in life, different problems to solve, there are different techniques we might use. Sometimes you might use persuasion, sometimes we might want to direct someone to do something. And so there's, different things for different situations. And so I realized that when we're doing anything in life, whether it's training for something or aiming for a goal in a work-related or in our personal lives, there's different ways to get there. And sometimes we need to stick with what we're doing, and sometimes we need to switch and change. Sometimes what we're doing isn't the right way forward, so we need to kind of change. So the example I give in the book, in SWITCHCRAFT, is I don't know if you play golf. I don't actually play golf, but I grew up beside a golf course, and I used to see people carrying very heavy golf bags with lots of different types of clubs. And of course, if you think about it, it makes sense that if you want to play a full round of golf, you need more than one type of club. Sometimes you have to hit very long shots, sometimes short shots, sometimes you're stuck in grass or in sand, and you need a different type of club to get you out of that. So if you had just one club, you'd be very, very good at certain things on the golf course, but you'd be really poor at all of the other things. So it's a little bit like that in life. I think in life, we need lots of different tactics. We need lots of different techniques to help us just deal with the challenges we're faced with. So that's really what SWITCHCRAFT is about. It's the idea about having a diverse range of tactics and ways to solve problems, and then having a good sense of whether we should stick with what we're doing, and sometimes that's the right answer, or do we need to switch? So I have to thank my husband, Kevin. He actually came up with the title. So I had various titles like the flexible mind or the flexible brain. And so he asked me to explain one day when I was writing the book, like, what exactly is it about? And I thought, well, it's about, sometimes you have to stick with what you're doing. Sometimes you have to switch. And if you switch, you need to then decide which is the right thing to switch to. So he thought, well, SWITCHCRAFT is a really good way of putting that. So the craft, if you like, of knowing when to switch and knowing when to stick. And ultimately, that will lead to a better and more successful life, I think.
不安感が強い人にとっての最大の問題は、脅威を過剰に検知することではなく、むしろ一旦検知した脅威を意識しないようにするのが不得手なことだと書かれています。これはどういうことでしょうか
？For many years, I've been studying anxious people, and my background is in cognitive psychology. So cognitive psychology study how we process information in the world around us. So how do we process the information we're faced with in the world? And we can look at that in our attention system, what we notice when you look in the newspaper, for example, or in a magazine, what are you drawn to very quickly? Is it a color? Is it a particular type of story? Some people are drawn to more negative stories. Some people are drawn to more positive stories. So we can study attention in that sense. We can also look at how we interpret the information we're presented with. So I'm sure we all know that people can say things, and it's very easy to interpret those in the wrong way. So again, anxious people would tend to interpret very ambiguous things in a very negative way. So if somebody made a comment about, oh, you're looking in, or that's an interesting thing you've just said. An anxious person might think, what exactly does she mean by that? Did she mean actually that's not very an intelligent thing to say, or it's not a very good thing to say? It might be a negative thing, or it might, maybe I genuinely mean it is a positive thing. You have said something really interesting, or it could just be neutral. Somebody might comment on your hair or how you look or some clothes you've just bought. And often it's quite neutral, but sometimes, we can interpret that in a negative way. And likewise, in terms of our memory, we can selectively remember more negative stuff than more positive stuff. And all of these biases are really linked with anxiety and depression in particular. So people who are prone to anxiety and depression will tend to selectively remember more negative things. They'll tend to notice more negative things in the world around them. So they have that bias in their attention system. And they also tend to have this bias in terms of interpreting information in a more negative way. So it's a bit of a long-winded way of answering your question, Icaro, but so I myself was lured into the idea that the negative bias itself was the bad thing. So that's a bad thing. And we do a lot of studies where we try to look at training methods where we can try and shift those biases in a less negative direction or in a more positive direction. So I'd always kind of had the idea that, you know, if you have these negative biases, that's not a good thing and it leads to anxiety and depression. But then a number of years ago, I started working with some colleagues and we were actually looking at military personnel, so soldiers going into a battle situation. And of course, in those situations, it's really important that people are actually vigilant for threat. You do kind of notice threat. Or if you can imagine, if you're on your own late at night in the house and you hear a noise and a window is breaking, you know, it's very important there. That may just be a tree banging against the window, or it could be somebody breaking in. So it is something that's important to pay attention to and to focus on and figure out, is this a dangerous situation or not? So in some situations, it's really important to have a negative bias. And so what I realized then is that, you know, a negative bias isn't always a bad thing. So when I started looking at it with some colleagues, we started looking at anxious people and thought, well, what is the real problem with anxious people? And I realized, even though I'd always kind of thought it was the negative bias is the problem, what I realized that wasn't really the case. The negative bias, anxious people have a negative bias when they're in a threatening situation, as most of us do. So that's a very appropriate thing. But the problem with anxious people is they also have that bias when they're in a very safe situation. So you can imagine when you're actually very safe, you're at home, there's no threat. Anxious people still have a negative bias. They'll still be worrying and thinking about what might go wrong, what bad things would happen. So I realized it's not so much the negative bias itself that's the problem, but it's the inflexibility of being able to switch off that bias. So for people who are less anxious, they may have a very strong negative bias if they're in a situation that they're unsure of, or a new situation, they're not really sure of themselves, or say going into a job interview where you're a bit nervous. It's quite appropriate to have that kind of negative bias. But the important thing is you need to be able to switch that off when you're in a safe, non-threatening situation. So that's where the idea for kind of switchcraft came from, like switching off those biases is really important. So kind of pulling those biases away, if you like, when you're in a safe situation is actually, that's the real problem. It's not the negative bias as such. So I hope that's kind of made sense. It's a bit of a long answer to your question, but...
日記を書くことの効果について書かれています。なぜ日記を書くことがスイッチクラフトの観点から重要なのでしょうか?
Well, one of the things in switchcraft is that, I say there's kind of four pillars, if you like, to switchcraft. There's four kind of important components to it. And one of those components is agility, which we've talked about. So the idea that we need to be mentally agile, we need to be flexible, and, you know, if something isn't working, maybe try out something different. So that's kind of really important. But the key thing is it's important not to do that just for its own sake. You know, there's no point changing just because you want to change. You need to change when it's appropriate to do so. So when it's actually going to work better for you. So in order to do that, a lot of the time we need to have a good degree of self-awareness to really understand ourselves, what our own values are, you know, what we really care about. And this is where a diary can be really powerful. So by actually writing a diary, it's just a way, and the important thing is this is a diary, you're not writing it for anybody else. So nobody else needs to ever see it. It's just, you know, you're jotting your own kind of thoughts down, your own kind of hopes and ambitions and things. And by doing that on a regular basis, people find that actually when they're really honest with themselves, you really begin to uncover like what are your real values. And, you know, people might, like a lot of people during the pandemic, for example, where they were working from home and couldn't go out and into work, a lot of people realized actually that they weren't really enjoying the jobs they were in, for example, or maybe their whole lifestyle wasn't really something that really was kind of a good fit with their own values. So writing a diary, it's a way of self-reflecting, I suppose, if you like, in a kind of in a very honest way. And because you have a physical record of it, you can always go back, you know, and depending what happens in your life, you might go back and say, what was I thinking 6 months ago? You know, what's actually changed in the last 6 months? So it can be a very, very kind of powerful way of doing that. And there is a lot of research just generally showing that keeping a diary on a regular basis is very, very good for your mental health generally, just in terms of, and I think it's because of that, it's because of that you're really honest. If you need to be honest in the diary and you're really reflecting and you get a sense of what you really enjoy doing, what's important, what your values are, and that will really help you you, the better you are at that, that will help you make the right decisions when you're faced with different choices.
変化とトランジションの違いについて説明され、トランジションのない変化が危険であると書かれています。これはどういうことでしょうか？
But it's a really interesting point. And if I just tell you one of the examples, I think I gave this example in the book. So I work quite a lot with elite athletes, so top sports people, to try and help them improve their mental strength and their mental focus. And of course, I've worked with a few people who are quite well-known athletes or footballers in different sports. And a couple of them, of course, are coming to retirement. And often top sports people retire at quite a young age. Like they may only be in their late 20s or 30s. So they still have a whole life in front of them, but they're actually very young. But, that if they're a top footballer or a top athlete, they may have to retire, around the age of 30. And of course, a lot of people then do something else. They're looking for what other job can they do? And a lot of them will go into sports commentary. They might kind of become a journalist. They might do something like that. And so one athlete I was working with did that. So he was I won't say who he was, but he was a top kind of track athlete, so a runner, very, very successful. He'd won lots of medals, won lots of, quite a well-known person. And so he was offered a job in the media to comment on sports, and so effectively become a journalist, to write a column, to commentate in a sports program. But very quickly, within the first year after he retired from sport, he really started developing a lot of problems, and he started drinking too much alcohol, and he had arguments with his wife, and a lot of things were going wrong in his life. And even though he was enjoying his job, he started kind of being late for things, and the media company who employed him, were saying, we can't keep you on if you're not going to be reliable, and all of that. So everything was going a little bit wrong for him. And we talked through a lot of this, and what we realized was that he hadn't really prepared himself so even though he prepared for the change, he kind of prepared this job. He knew that when he was retiring from athletics, he would announce his retirement. He knew he would have this job he could go to, but he hadn't really thought about that transition, that I'm now not a top athlete anymore. I'm now actually a journalist, and that's a very different thing. And of course, what he really missed was, as an athlete, he was used to a lot of adulation, a lot of people celebrating him, and he was quite a well-known person. So, he was kind of used to that. And what he was also used to was having a very strict training schedule. So his coach would tell him, okay, you've got 3 training sessions today, you've got another 2 tomorrow. And he would have a very rigid kind of plan of action. He would have to do his training sessions. He had a very rigid diet he had to stick to, and so of course what happened is, when all of that disappeared, he didn't have his coach anymore. He didn't have anyone really managing him. He could do what he wanted, he could eat what he wanted, he could drink what he wanted. And of course he kind of lost a bit of control of that, because, it was something very new for him. And so that's what I mean by transition. He hadn't really made the transition in his head that I'm now actually a presenter on television, so I need to kind of behave in the way that's appropriate for that. And I need to manage my own lifestyle. I don't have a coach telling me when I should train or what I should eat, or, so it's that the change is one thing, but the transition to really get yourself into that new identity, because it is a new identity. And it's a little bit what we mentioned earlier about understanding your values. So the values that are most important to you, say, as an athlete, is things like, not drinking too much, doing all of your training. Whereas actually in a job like as a journalist, those things may not be as important. It's not so big a problem if you have a drink occasionally, or if you eat a little bit too much. But, as an athlete, that is a big problem. So I think he hadn't shifted that identity. And that was what was really causing the problems. So when we kind of realized that, and he worked through that, and he really tried to develop this new identity, that he's now actually, he's not a top sportsman anymore. He's an ex-sportsman. He's retired. He's now a journalist. He's now a TV presenter. That really helped him. He was able to kind of just really manage his life much better. And that goes for anything. You don't have to be, a top sports person, but any of us who change roles. So for example, it happens when you become, say, a parent for the first time. If somebody has their first baby, suddenly you're transitioning from being a single person where you might go out a lot with your friends. Suddenly you have a little baby to look after. You probably have to stay home a lot more. You have responsibilities. You can't just disappear and leave your baby on its own. So all of those things in life require there's obviously a big change will come anyway, but you need to get that transition into your head. I'm now a mother or a father rather than a single person, and that's quite a different identity.
転職したり、結婚したり、大事な人を亡くしたり、人生の転機には空白の時間を持つことが重要であると書かれています。空白の時間を持つことにはどんな効果があるのでしょうか？
Yeah, so this comes down to one of the techniques that I use in my experiments in the lab is a thing called task switching. So when we're switching from one task to the other, and in the lab we use very simple things. So I'll give you an example. So we might have in a cognitive psychology lab, you might have a number of individual digits are presented on the computer screen. So let's say a digit between 1 and 20 is presented. And if it's presented in the red color, so if it's printed in red, you have to say, is this an odd number or an even number? So you press a button if it's odd, you press another button if it's even number. Whereas if it appears in green, say, you then have to say, is it below 9 or above 9? So it's a different task. So, you might be going along and each digit is being presented and you're saying, odd, even, odd, even, odd, even. And then suddenly the color changes. Now you have to say, oh, it's above or below 9. So that task switch actually causes a lot of interference in our brain. So you get a big interrupt, if you like. So when we're measuring reaction time or when we're measuring electrical activity in the brain, what you find is you get a big interrupt when you're switching from one task to the other like that. And that's actually quite draining of energy. So even in that very simple task, it kind of drains us of energy. So if you think about things like, for most of us, like in my job, for example, I always have lots of different projects going on at any given time. So I might be doing some writing, say writing a book chapter. I might be writing a scientific paper. I might have a grant application I'm working on. I might be preparing a lecture, preparing a teaching session. So all of those different projects, often what we do is, especially when we're busy, we'll jump from one to the other. Once you finish one thing, you'll straight away go on to the next thing. Now, if you think about it, that's a task switch. So you're switching from one project to quite a different project. So what all of the psychology science shows is that you need to take a little break between those two things because otherwise you get very drained of energy. So in other words, even if it's only a couple of minutes, so if you finish one project before instantly moving on to the next one, maybe just stand up and walk around a bit, maybe go and get a cup of coffee, just have a little break like that. And that's what Fritz Perls called the fertile void, really. He was talking about much bigger things where if, for example, like the example we used earlier, if you suddenly become a new parent or you get married or you get divorced, those big life changes, that's a real switch from one type of life to another type of life. And so you just need to give yourself that gap to allow your brain to kind of fully disengage, if you like, from the first thing before you can really re-engage with the next thing. So the mistake a lot of people make, I think, is they have a big life change like that and they instantly jump on to the next thing without really undoing and really accepting that, like the example I gave with the athlete, he hadn't really accepted that I'm now retired, I'm no longer an athlete. So he kind of jumped straight into a new job. And because he hadn't really given himself enough time to really think, okay, this is something very different. I need to forget about all that. I'm not going to have the same level of training. I'm not going to have the same level of people telling me what I should be doing. He didn't give himself enough time to do that and then to switch on to the next thing. So that's what I mean by that fertile void. So it can work at different levels. It can just be like in your everyday job. It might be just going from one project to the next, or it might be going from those much bigger life changes. And it's just important to give yourself that kind of time, or even going home from work at the end of the day to home, just giving yourself a little break to make sure you don't arrive home and you're still thinking about all the work things you haven't done. And, that's not going to be very good for your partner or whoever is at home. It's going to kind of, you haven't really switched off from work. You're now in a new situation. So just even if it's something like, just going for a walk, or, just something, or stopping for a coffee on the way home, just some break so you can say, okay, I'll forget about that. And now I'm moving on to a new thing. And, and that's what we mean by that kind of fertile void, which I always thought was quite a nice phrase, nice way of putting it, I think.
イギリスの海兵隊の訓練で、一日の訓練が終わるタイミングで、皆がこれで戻って休めると感じているその時に、追加トレーニングを課すことで、想定外の事態に直面する精神的な苦痛を受け入れる訓練をする というお話がありました。先のことを想定すること自体が危険なのでしょうか？
Well, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think the way our brain works is by predicting the future all the time. Our brain, we used to think the brain works by reacting to things that happen in the world, but actually that's not really the case. The brain is predicting all the time. And of course, the problem with that is, and so that example with the Marines is a very good way of training for the unexpected, because because our brain expects something, we kind of prepare ourselves for that, and then if something totally different happens, we can really be in a difficult situation. So the Marines have that kind of sense of training, and it's also used a lot in sports with sports teams to kind of try and expect the unexpected, if you like, as much as you can. And the idea behind it is, and often what happens is, like the soldiers might have a very long training session, they might be out for a long run, and then they're suddenly told, when they think they've come to the finish, they're told, oh, you have to run another mile. But actually what happens is, when they run around the corner, actually there's a fan there to take them home. So often they don't have to run the extra mile. But it's just to kind of get used to that expectation that even when you think, okay, this is finished now, you might be told, actually, no, it isn't. And of course, if you think about it in terms of sport, I'm not sure what the most popular sport is in Japan, but I know you have a very good football team, soccer team. But in most team sports, you might kind of think, okay, the end is going to come at a certain time. There's a certain time limit. But actually, you might suddenly have extra time. And sometimes, if there's been injuries during the match, for example, you might have extra time. And that can really catch out teams, because if everyone is thinking, we've only got 3 minutes left, so actually we'll put all our energy into the next 3 minutes. And then suddenly you're told, oh, there's 10 minutes extra time. Some teams can really, really struggle then, and they've already burnt themselves out, if you like. So it's that sense of training for the unexpected, and it's like that in our everyday life. Just all of us get surprises, things happen that you don't really expect, so somehow trying to learn how to deal with those challenges and those unexpected things, so that you get used to it. You get used to the idea that not everything works out as you predicted, which doesn't mean we shouldn't predict things. I mean, I think we almost have to. You have to predict what's going on. But it's at the same time understanding that not all the predictions will come true. And if that happens, you still need to cope with that and need to deal with that. And that's, again, exactly at the heart of what SWITCHCRAFT is all about. It's about having that agility, that even though what you expected hasn't happened, you still need to deal with that.
メンタルアジリティという言葉について説明されています。メンタルアジリティとは何でしょうか？
Well, it really is. It's just having that ability to switch, and I think all of us probably have had the experience. If you imagine a situation at home where you can't find your keys, for example, you can't find the keys of the house, and most people might have a particular place they put those keys, and you're looking for them, and you keep looking in that place, and they're not there, but you keep coming back and you look in the same place again. So that's kind of a simple example of how the brain can get a little bit rigid. We keep going back to searching in a place, even though we know we've already looked there and they're definitely not there. So I think all of us can get a little bit rigid in how we deal with things and how we deal with problems. And this is particularly the case when we get anxious. So if you're under a lot of stress, under a lot of strain, we can become quite rigid in how we do things and keep trying to find the same solution. So the idea of being more agile is to really be able to step back from that and to have the flexibility to try out different things and try and switch, really. As we said, like sometimes you need to stick, but sometimes you need to switch. So some people know they need to switch, but they just physically can't. They just can't bring themselves to try things in a different way. So for example, it might even be if you're negotiating, for example, with somebody, there might be kind of different tactics you can use, and if one particular tactic isn't really working with somebody, you might just need to shift and try something quite different, where some people will find that very difficult because it's not something they're comfortable with. So I think it's just having that ability to switch when what you're currently doing isn't really working very well.
ネガティブな感情にとらわれやすい人は、一つのネガティブな出来事があると、その人の中にある他のネガティブな感情や過去のネガティブな記憶が一斉に関連づいて刺激され、一つのストレス以上の巨大なストレスになってしまうという話がありました。なぜこのようなことが起こってしまうのでしょうか？
Again, yes, so a lot of my research is looking at these patterns of cognitive biases that we mentioned. So, we can have bias in our attention system, in our memory system, in our interpretation. So, what do we notice when we open the newspaper, for example? What do we remember? Do we remember good things or bad things? So all of those biases have generally been studied in psychology quite separately. So, some people have done a lot of work on attention biases, others have done lots of work on memory biases. So in a big study I did in Oxford before I left, we actually followed school children from the age of about 12 until the age of about 17. So effectively over their secondary school years, from being quite young teenagers to being just about to leave school. And what we did was we measured all of these biases, along with lots of other things. We measured genetics and lots of other things. And what we discovered was, it was quite interesting. So one of the questions we had was, what makes people more resilient? So some of the children in the school were quite anxious, some were quite depressed, but some were very kind of happy, if you like. They were kind of, they were quite resilient, they were doing very well. So we were trying to understand at a cognitive level, what are the predictors of that? And what we discovered was a little bit of a surprise, but I thought it actually fits in quite well to this idea of agility. Because as I said, we measured all of these three different biases separately. And then we can look at how these biases correlate with each other. So how do they relate to each other? And what we discovered by looking at kind of brain imaging and brain analysis, what we discovered that for the people who are much more depressed and anxious, when they developed, say, an attention bias, that instantly led to a bias in memory and a bias interpretation. So everything was almost like it was a network, and the whole network got activated very easily. But with the people who were doing much better, so they were kind of flourishing, as we call them, they didn't have the strongest connections between those biases. So they would be able to, for example, think about something quite bad. Maybe they'd think about some very sad memory, but that wouldn't necessarily lead to a bias in interpretation or bias in attention, which it did with the anxious people. So if an anxious person had a sad memory, instantly their whole system would become very negative and they would ruminate on negativity. Whereas the people who were doing much better, were kind of high on the flourishing scale, they actually were able to have these negative thoughts, but it didn't flow on to the other negative thoughts. So it was that kind of pattern of connections seemed to be much more disconnected. And of course, when we thought about that, we realized that may be why people who are more resilient tend to be much more flexible, mentally agile or mentally flexible, because you don't have those tight connections between them. It's much easier. You can switch one bias off, if you like, without putting another bias on. So it's almost like that negativity isn't as tightly connected in their brains.
認知的柔軟性とは何ですか？認知的柔軟性とメンタルアジリティの関係について教えてください。
So cognitive flexibility is really the fundamental processes in the brain that underlie agility. So when we've been talking about mental agility, we're talking about things like maybe persuasion tactics and switching from one to the other, or different ways of regulating your emotions. There may be different techniques to do that. But so that's at quite a broad level, if you like, in everyday life. But obviously in the brain, we have all of these things. And one of the things I mentioned was task switching, which is this idea of, sometimes you have to decide whether a digit is odd or even, and then if is it another color, if it's below or above a certain number, like say 9. So that task switching is effectively cognitive flexibility. So we know that the longer it takes you to switch, when the task changes, the longer it takes you, the bigger delay you have in switching is quite a good measure of cognitive inflexibility. So people who are very cognitively flexible can shift quite quickly and can move to the next task quite quickly, whereas people who have more difficulty with that will take much longer. So we call that, there is actually a measure we can measure in cognitive psychology called the switch cost, which is just the difference in time when you switch from one thing to the other. So the switch cost gives us quite a nice objective measure of cognitive flexibility in the brain. And we can kind of measure that with brain imaging techniques and just in terms of reaction time. So it's really the if you like, it's the kind of the absolute basis in the brain, which ultimately comes up into mental agility generally. So if we're quite good, if our cognitive flexibility is quite good, the chances are we'll find it easier to be much more mentally agile with much bigger things in life.
認知的柔軟性は訓練によって鍛えられると書かれています。どのような訓練によって鍛えることができるのか教えてください。
Sure. So one of the things I talk about in the book is kind of very simple things we can all do to train our cognitive flexibility. And so I mentioned before, when we're doing different projects and different tasks, it's very important to have a little gap in between them. So to make sure you have a disconnect between one task and the other. But in terms of training, of course, you can do the opposite. You can actually have a situation where you might have, say, 3 tasks, but literally go from one to the other very quickly. So you're training your brain to shift very quickly. So a very simple example I give is you come up with maybe 3 tasks you have to do, and not really big, complicated things, but maybe you might have to write a short article. In your case, for example, if you're a journalist, you might have a short article to write. You might want to write an email, a long email to someone. You might need to be contacting someone, write a long email. You might want to, say, ring up and book a restaurant, to go out to a restaurant for dinner. So, 3 different tasks. And what you do is you simply set a timer to go off at whatever time period. So give yourself maybe 10, 15 minutes altogether, and give yourself, a couple of minutes for each task. And so what happens is you start off in your first task. When the timer goes off, you instantly have to switch to the next task, even if you're not finished the first one. And then the same thing, you start on that task. Once the timer goes off again, you go on to the third task. And then same thing, once the timer goes off, you go back to the first task again. So even though that's not a good idea in general, as a training exercise, that is actually a very good idea, because it's training your brain to switch very rapidly from one mental set to another mental set.
夫のケビン・ダントンさんと共に、オックスフォードエリートパフォーマンス社という会社を共同で設立したと書かれています。これはどんな会社でしょうか？
Yes, so Oxford Elite Performance, we set up as a kind of, because we realized we were both doing a lot of consultancy with many like top sports people, as I mentioned before. So a lot of sports teams, for example. So we worked with some Premier League teams in the UK. And we worked with some individuals, so like athletes or footballers or in different sports, and really helping them to, but things like, for example, mental agility, as we're talking about. So, in a lot of sports, that kind of flexibility is quite important. So in football, for example, you might have a particular way of playing that you feel comfortable with, and a team might be quite good at, say, being quite defensive, and but in some matches it might turn out that actually that's not very effective. It may not be working very well against a different team. So sometimes you need to switch your tactics and say, actually we need to play a much more open, fast game rather than our usual defensive game. And some teams find that very difficult to make that switch. So we worked a lot with teams to try and help them become more flexible, and individuals as well. So again, with a lot of athletes, they may have had a particular strategy, how you run a race, for example. You might like to stay in the middle, and then as you come up to the end of the race, you sprint. If you have a fast finish, you might be able to sprint. But depending who else is in the race, that may not be a very good tactic. You may need to go out much faster than you normally do and try and stay ahead of everybody, or you may need to hold back a bit more and just kind of really track the person who's your main competitor. So there's different. You need to be flexible about how you deal with those situations. So we work a lot with sports people. We worked a lot with people in the military as well. So people in kind of military situations, but they also need to be very flexible and very open to, and as I said, helping people to get used to uncertainty and get used to when things don't work out quite as you expected, because in military situations that's very common, of course. You expect and you're predicting certain things, but actually something totally different might happen, and you have to be able to deal with that situation very quickly. So we would help people there. And of course, we also then did some consultancy in business, people working in business, because it's the same situation there, that often you might have different plans and different goals about developing new products or whatever it is. But if the world changes, you might need to change that completely, and it's very important for people to be kind of flexible. So we kind of work with a lot of people in those different occupations around how to become more resilient and how to become more mentally agile.
ある高名な占い師がどのように人の心を読み取り、そのことを占いという行為に生かしているかというお話がありました。特に話の仕方と動向の変化で相談者の置かれている状況を見抜くと書かれています。 占い師がどのように人の心の動きを見ているのか教えてください。
Yes, well, I thought, well, I should test myself when I was writing the book, and because as a scientist, I'm kind of quite skeptical about fortune tellers. So but I thought actually I should keep an open mind. I mean, part of what I say in the book is we should be open-minded about things. So I went to a fortune teller in London and just thought, I'll see what kind of happens. And it's in the reason why it's important is because in SWITCHCRAFT I mentioned these 4 pillars of SWITCHCRAFT, and one of them is being very aware of your situation. So in order to make the right decision, like if you are going to switch to something else, you need to really understand your situation. Say in a business situation, you need to understand the market very well. You need to understand the situation you're in. So I thought, well, that's something that actually fortune tellers are really good at. They're really, really good at kind of picking up on cues. So what they'll do is they'll ask you some very general question, or they'll make a very general comment, like, for example, I can see some big change coming up in your life. And then they look very carefully to see how you react to that. And of course, when I went there, I was thinking about moving from Oxford to Australia. So I was thinking, and of course, that's a big move. And of course, even though I was trying not to give anything away, I think I probably did give something away. Oh, okay, yeah, I am actually thinking about something quite a big change. But when I look back on it, I realized they hadn't actually come up with any real information. They just made this very general comment. And what they do is they watch very carefully and observe what changes. And one of the things we know from psychology is that when you're really interested in something or you're excited about something, your pupil will actually increase. So some people can get very, very good at noticing that, so that if they say something that actually really resonates with you and really, this is something you're excited about or really thinking about or interested in, your pupils will actually get a little bit bigger. So it's very hard to hide that. And I think that's, I don't want to disappoint people. I know lots of people will believe in fortune tellers, but I'm still reasonably skeptical. And I think that's, but it's an important lesson how all of us can be much better at really tuning into people and tuning into the situation. And sometimes when you make those general comments, you can get a kind of sense, is somebody not interested in that or they are interested in that, and I think it's that sense. That's why I kind of did that as a kind of experiment, just to see how good they were. And the lady I went to was extremely good. She was really impressive, actually. And even though I was trying very hard not to give away anything, it was very hard not to.